I welcome you to the second day of this Urban Age conference on governing urban futures. With this introductory presentation, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going back to some of the research which we have prepared over the last years, adding to what we have already heard from my colleague Ricky Burdett and Austin Siderman, informing hopefully some of the discussions. And I'm also going to provide some pointers to today's agenda. As you will have seen in the program after this session, we will focus a bit more on specific contents of urban governance. We'll look at the land question, we'll move on and talk about strategic infrastructure, and after the lunch break, we'll continue with a session on urban leadership, and then probably most importantly, we'll bring all of that to India with a final concluding session on governing India's urban future. Now, before moving forward, let's look backwards. What happened yesterday? This is not what happened in the room. It's a summary of our Twitter feed, and in some ways also an encouragement for you to keep on tweeting, and an overview of the key themes that emerged from yesterday. It's, of course, as expected, dominated by this relationship between government and governance, and I think it was very interesting. We were provoked by Sue Parnell of her perspective on this idea of the tyranny of governance, which we need to overcome. We also recognize other pairs. Look at people and mayors. That's maybe a pair where we have the tension between direct and representative democracy, which came up in the last panel, where Ashwin and Sanjeev had a bit of a go at each other in that regard. Interestingly, there are a couple of contents which we're going to focus on, which yesterday weren't featured really. Land, the one I mentioned already, and infrastructure, you hardly recognize in this overview. So let me now move on to one of these research fragments, which was part of our preparation. And you'll find the information also in our conference newspaper. It's a survey of city governments, a survey that's part of a bigger research program we're currently running at LSE Cities in partnership with the MacArthur Foundation, with UN Habitat and UCLG, and I'm very glad that we have colleagues in the room from all of the three organizations. The principal aim of this survey was to unpack and map the formal systems, the institutionalized systems of urban governments that exist across the world. At this point, I'm going to show you the result of 50 cities across 30 countries and across different wealth levels. By no means is this a representative sample, but it is an interesting snapshot which I think will help us in the conversation today and maybe trigger some additional thinking to what we have seen already yesterday. The motivation behind conducting this kind of work relates to an ongoing and persistent data challenge anyone is facing working on urban governance, on comparative urban governance, where we simply don't know enough about what is happening on the ground in very diverse contexts. And this diversity of the role of city government, of course, came up yesterday. But let me just illustrate that with two extreme examples. This is a photo of one of the world's largest solar thermal power plants. It's called Andasol 3, located in southern Spain, producing renewable electricity for about 100,000 people. It's an urban project. In fact, it's a project by a city government, the city of Munich, located more than 1,700 kilometers away, but due to its public ownership of its local utility company, is a major player on the international renewable energy market. Another scalar surprise of urban governance relates to this photo. This is Santiago de Chile. It's a bike path. And in this capital of Chile, quite a significant amount of cycling infrastructure is planned, financed, and managed by Chile's national government. Now, for those of you who know Chile, that's not a surprise. It's a highly centralized country, and in particular, with regards to urban functions of its capital, it's the national government that leads. The question of autonomy of cities came up as a major, in some ways, characterizations of the role of city governments. And in our survey, one way of reflecting autonomy is the extent to which city budgets rely on transfers from national government. Again, I'm showing you here two extremes. La Paz, 85% of the city's budget comes from Bolivia's national government. By contrast, Stockholm only relies to 5% on the Swedish state. I could go on and fill the whole day on these examples of how divergent the role of city governments are. But I think at least as important as that diversity is what different cities actually share with regards to their urban governance. I'll start with three broader patterns and then go a bit deeper into the role of city governments. First, I guess, the big question, or in fact, the biggest question we could possibly ask. In what capacity can citizens actually influence local policies? So this is a question which we pose to 50 cities only. And it's a very skewed sample, and I mentioned before it's not representative. But I do believe what we're seeing here on the screen is probably a tendency which will become or will be confirmed in our research over the coming years. Voting and elections is still the predominant form to which we influence local policy, followed by public consultations, online engagements, and then very interestingly, there were 18 cities that use participatory budgeting. For those that are aware of those kind of initiatives, you will know that these are increasing. These kind of approaches have recently been even rolled out in European cities. Paris recently adopted participatory budgeting. We asked about governance disruptions, and it's probably obvious that the recent economic recession here comes first as an external factor that is interfering with how cities operate and go along with their business. This is followed by changes in national policies, institutional reforms, and political conflict. Tax reforms, by contrast, and natural disasters are the outliers in this case. And finally, here an overview on the constraints cities are facing, probably constraints in planning ahead, looking into the future. Brings us back again to Austin's point about uncertainty. It's not the absolute level of funding that comes first. It's the predictability of resources, which makes it so difficult for cities to deal with themselves. Similarly, of interest was sort of the stuff that's at the bottom here. It seems cities are not worried or not constrained too much by a lack of overall public and also private sector support. Let me now come to the core of the question we have been also asking yesterday. It's a look at different policy sectors and to what extent these, you could call them classic urban policy sectors, are indeed sort of led by or part of urban level decision making. This is where we have an interesting pattern to emerge. I think intuitively we all would know what city governments do. But we haven't seen any real evidence on this. And we felt that this overview, where we now looked at different sectors of policy making, and we asked the question about who is actually leading. Anything in red here is in fact related to the metropolitan, city, or sub-city scale. Anything in gray, higher tiers of government. A relatively clear hierarchy emerges, and it's a hierarchy where, again, intuitively I think we know this. It's led by spatial planning, culture, utilities, urban transport. By contrast, economic development, education, and health are highly centralized functions of the state. This provides a first pointer to the session that's going to follow. Not only does spatial planning define what cities do, that's good, it does remind us of the enormous responsibilities cities have in dealing with one of the most important early 21st century challenges. This is something Karen Seto will come back to. Her research suggests that over a period of only 30 years, from 2000 to 2030, we will increase urban land threefold, over only 30 years. Managing that increase, or even better, reducing that increase, will inevitably have to involve urban governments. Gerald Frug yesterday reminded us that, in fact, there is no single policy sector that is purely led by one tier of government. That is important, and in some ways, where we here now unpacking the more details that lie behind one single sector, the case of transport, we realize what Gerald was on about. Look at the enormous diversity we are seeing in a sector that overall is perceived as an urban sector, urban transport. It's the sector where many mayors are celebrated for their innovative action. But if you look deep into the components of urban transport, you see a very clear hierarchy. The more strategic, the more capital intensive, the more the national government or state governments come back into the picture. And it's that strategic layer, which is the second pointer for our session on infrastructure, which will be absolutely central. Now, we might be tired as urbanists of looking at these comparisons between cities, but this is a conversation which we have to pursue, emphasizing to other policymakers the importance of strategic infrastructure, of spatial planning, and the interconnectivity between them. In fact, maybe spatial planning, or better, even infrastructure planning, are among the few areas where we can proactively design futures. I want to show you with this example what I mean by it. What we see is here Atlanta and its footprint, the spatial extent, and Berlin on the other hand, and mapped on top the strategic public transport infrastructure. It's no surprise that the enormous difference between two cities would actually have fairly similar wealth levels, fairly similar numbers of populations, and probably similar quality of life. I mean, that's open for debate. But it's no surprise that one locks you into a very one-dimensional choice for transport, with less than 10% of people commuting or actually in overall mobility patterns using public transport, the bike, or indeed walk, whereas that's a share in Berlin which is almost 70%. Once you're locked into this, you're not going to get away from it, or at least not over a period of a few decades. Now, it's because of those two issues of land and the strategic infrastructure and the involvement of city governments in that we're currently seeing, and it's probably something which has happened over the last 10 years, not much longer, that policy circles that have traditionally not had much time for the agenda we are discussing here, much time for planning, much time for design, much time for questions related to spatial development, are now discovering the urban dimension. This brings me to this photo. What you see here is the launch at the United Nations of the report Better Growth, Better Climate. It's a report by the so-called Commission on the Economy and Climate, and you can see here the former president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, alongside Nick Stern and Jeremy Oppenheim, who all worked on this report, handing a copy to Ban Ki-moon. LSE Cities had the privilege to work and lead the section on cities and provide fresh evidence on the relationship between actions that can strengthen economic performance and those reducing the risk of dangerous climate change. And we were absolutely stunned how over a course of a year, it was the theme of cities, not energy, not agriculture, not land use, not macroeconomics. It was the theme of cities which really resonated most, not with mayors, we know that, but with national leaders, with finance ministers, and in fact with our colleagues broadly involved in macroeconomics. For them, a lot of this still felt like it's news. It's something they need to think more about. And there are a couple of maybe vulgar statistics, but this is the stuff that resonates with those colleagues of ours, where we estimated that the external costs of sprawl in the United States might be in the region of $400 billion per year. This is very serious in terms of long-term costs related to health, related to infrastructure, congestion costs. And on the other hand, there is the good news which relates to the massive opportunity of saving capital investments related to developing infrastructure. And we all know about the severe infrastructure financing gap that is facing, in particular, developing and emerging economies. And we have this opportunity of reducing those costs by following a path which can broadly be described a more compact path of urban growth, $3 trillion over 15 years. So let me conclude by saying that our engagement at this conference with the relationship of institutions or governance, the how of the city on the one hand, and on the other hand, with the spatial configuration, the planning, the design, the what, is not an abstract conversation. This, as we have seen already yesterday, is a very real engagement with our concrete world and understanding how we are building what we're seeing out there. Thank you very much.